Hello, my dear lore seekers. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories. Tonight, we journey back to a time of myth and shadow, to an age when magic was a wild and dangerous force, and those who wielded it operated in the dark corners of the map, far from the prying eyes of councils and laws. Settle in. Quiet your mind, and let us explore the very foundations of the wizarding world's darkest fears, as we uncover the complete, horrific history of a fortress built on pain, and the sorcerer who called it home. The dark legacy of Ekrizdis, and the birth of Azkaban. Before we begin, if you find value in our stories, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support is what allows us to continue these journeys together. We appreciate it more than you know. And now, let's begin. We are stepping away from the warm, torch-lit corridors of Hogwarts tonight. We are leaving behind the safety of the known world to sail into much colder, darker waters. We are going to explore the origins of the most terrifying place in the wizarding world. A place that makes the Chamber of Secrets look like a playground. We are talking about the fortress of Azkaban, and, more importantly, the man, if you can call him that, who created it. The Dark Sorcerer Ekrizdis. Growing up, or perhaps when you first encountered the stories, Azkaban was always just this looming, inevitable threat. It was simply the place where the bad guys went, a rock in the middle of the ocean guarded by monsters. But the history of that rock is far older and far more disturbing than just a government prison. It is a story of the pre-ministry era, a time of lawlessness and deep magic, where a single sorcerer could carve out a kingdom of pain in the middle of the North Sea. I've been researching deep into the archives, pulling from old ministry records and fragments of lore to piece together the full, horrific picture for you. It's a long journey tonight, one that will take us through the psychology of torture, the politics of magical containment, and the very nature of the soul itself. So, if you're ready, I want you to make sure your doors are locked and your windows are latched. Turn the lights down low. Grab your wand, pull your blanket up tight, and let's cast off into the mist. To truly understand the horror of Ekrizdis, we first have to understand the world that allowed him to exist. We need to cast our minds back to the 15th century. In our history books, this is the late Middle Ages, a time of knights and kings. But in the magical world, it was an era of fragmentation. The British wizarding world was fractured and largely unregulated long before the Ministry of Magic established its iron grip. You see, the Ministry of Magic as we know it didn't officially exist until 1707. Before that, we had the Wizards' Council, a looser, less organized body that struggled to enforce magical law across the British Isles. The International Statute of Secrecy hadn't been signed yet. That wouldn't happen until 1689. This meant that the boundaries between the magical and muggle worlds were porous. It was a dangerous time, a wild west of sorcery, where a wizard of sufficient power and malice could operate with near total impunity, especially if they chose to live on the fringes of society. It is in this vacuum of authority that Ekrizdis emerges. He is a figure shrouded in mystery. We don't know his nationality, though the name Ekrizdis has a harsh, unfamiliar cadence to British ears, suggesting he may have travelled from Eastern Europe, or perhaps even further afield, bringing with him dark arts that were unknown to the druidic traditions of the Isles. He was a practitioner of the worst kinds of magic, the kinds that don't just break the laws of the land, but the laws of nature. Ekrizdis sought solitude. He didn't want to rule the world like Voldemort or Grindelwald. He didn't crave the adoration of purebloods or the subjugation of muggles. He wanted a laboratory. He wanted a place where he could peel back the layers of reality and see what writhed underneath. And he found the perfect spot, a jagged rock in the middle of the North Sea, miles from any coastline, battered by freezing winds and relentless waves. But Ekrizdis didn't just move on to an island. He created a void. Using concealment charms of incredible complexity, magic that likely predated and surpassed the protective enchantments we see around Hogwarts, he wiped the island from the map. He made it unplottable. To the magical eye and the muggle eye alike, the patch of ocean where Azkaban stood appeared empty. Ships could sail right through the space where the fortress lay and see nothing but grey water and mist. This concealment was his first blueprint. It turned the island into a trap. And this is where the story begins to take its darkest turn. Imagine you are a muggle sailor in the 1400s. You are navigating the treacherous waters of the North Sea, trading between England and Scandinavia. The sea is rough, the sky is dark, and you are relying on the stars and your primitive charts. Suddenly, the fog thickens. The wings dies down, not naturally, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. Ekrizdis didn't just hide, he hunted. It is believed that he used lure enchantments, perhaps similar to the siren songs of mythology, or perhaps he simply manipulated the weather to drive ships off course. He wanted subjects. He wanted playthings. When a ship breached the concealment charms, the sailors wouldn't see a haven. They would see a nightmare rising from the waves, a fortress of black stone, seamless and imposing, looking less like it was built and more like it had erupted from the ocean floor. Once those sailors stepped onto the island, they were gone. They had fallen out of the world. No one would hear their screams. No one would find their bodies. They belonged to Ekrizdis. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of mind desires this? Ekrizdis is the ultimate grim dark figure. He represents the absolute zero of empathy. He viewed these sailors not as human beings with families and souls, but as biomass, as raw material for his experiments. This mirrors the terrifying coldness we see in other universes, like the Necrons of the 41st millennium, who view other life forms as mere vermin or data points. Ekrizdis possessed that same mechanical detachment. He stripped these men of their humanity before he even touched them with a curse, simply by the way he perceived them. Let's talk about the fortress itself. Azkaban. The name alone sounds jagged, harsh. The architecture of the place reflects the mind of its creator. Unlike Hogwarts, which is a place of whimsy, with moving staircases and talking portraits, Azkaban was designed for one purpose: suffering. The fortress is triangular. In magical geometry, triangles can represent stability, but they can also represent a funnel, a focusing of energy. It is likely that the shape of the fortress was designed to channel magical energy, or perhaps to channel pain. The walls were built of stone, but not just any stone. It is described as black and cold. I believe Ekrizdis used alchemy to fuse the stone, perhaps mixing it with the blood of his victims or dark potions to make it impervious to the elements. The North Sea is brutal. Salt spray and gale force winds destroy normal masonry in decades. But Azkaban stands eternal. It suggests the structure is held together as much by magic as by mortar. Inside, it was a labyrinth, but not a labyrinth to confuse intruders, a labyrinth to isolate the occupants. We can imagine corridors that stretch on too long, angles that don't quite add up, rooms that seem to shrink when you're not looking. It was a non-Euclidean nightmare, designed to break the mind before the torture even began. And torture was the primary industry of the island. But Ekrizdis wasn't an interrogator. He wasn't looking for information. He was a researcher. He was experimenting on the nature of the soul. He wanted to know what happened when you pushed a human being past the point of breaking. He wanted to know if death was a barrier or a doorway. This brings us to the most horrific legacy of Ekrizdis: the creatures that infested the island, the Dementors. If you ask most wizards where Dementors come from, they shrug. They are treated like elemental forces, things that just are, like fungi or poltergeists. But the history of Azkaban suggests a much more specific and much more terrifying origin. Dementors were not native to the island. They were found there when the Ministry finally discovered the place. The prevailing theory among dark lore scholars is that Ekrizdis created them. Or, perhaps more accurately, he cultivated them. Think about the environment he engineered. He trapped hundreds of sailors, subjected them to unimaginable torture, and stripped them of all hope. He created a concentrated singularity of despair. In the magical world, emotions have power. Love can save Harry Potter. Hate can create a Horcrux. What does a century of concentrated, unadulterated despair create. It creates a vacuum, a hole in the world where happiness cannot exist. And nature abhors a vacuum. Something had to fill it. I believe the Dementors are the result of Ekrizdis' experiments in soul magic. Perhaps they are the corrupted remnants of the sailors' souls, stripped of all personality and left with only a hunger for what they lost. Or perhaps they are parasites from another dimension, maybe something akin to the void or the warp, that were drawn to the feast of misery Ekrizdis provided. They are immortal. They cannot die because they are not truly alive. They are like a virus or a fungus that grows on decay. And Ekrizdis was the gardener. Imagine the scene. A dark sorcerer walking the ramparts of his black tower, surrounded by a legion of gliding, cloaked figures. Did they attack him? Or did they recognize him as their father, their provider? It implies that Ekrizdis had no happiness left in him for them to feed on. He was so consumed by the dark arts that he was invisible to them. Or perhaps his mind was so alien that they found no sustenance in it. He lived among them. He walked through halls filled with the screams of dying men and the rattling breath of Dementors. It is a level of gothic horror that puts even the darkest vampires to shame. Like all men, Ekrizdis eventually died. We don't know how. Did a ritual backfire? Did he succumb to old age? Did his children finally turn on him? Or did he simply achieve what he wanted, some form of twisted transcendence, and leave his body behind? Whatever the cause, his death changed everything. When a wizard dies, the enchantments they maintain begin to unravel. It's like a knot losing its tension. The concealment charms that had hidden the island for decades, perhaps centuries, began to fail. The mist cleared, the navigation hazards vanished, and suddenly there was a spot on the map that hadn't been there before. The magical community noticed. Perhaps sensitive wizards felt the sudden release of dark energy. Perhaps a ship finally survived the passage and reported the Black Tower. The Ministry of Magic, still a young organization trying to establish order in the chaotic world of the 1700s, sent an expedition. We can picture them, aurors in heavy wool cloaks, clutching their wands, arriving on broomsticks or enchanted boats. They expected to find a smuggler's den, maybe a rogue warlock. What they found broke them. The records state that those who entered the fortress refused to speak of what they saw. That silence is the loudest testimony we have. These were hardened law enforcement officers. They had seen curses. They had seen death. But they had never seen Azkaban. They found the Dementors. Not just a few, but a swarm. Without Ekrizdis to bring them fresh victims, the creatures were starving. They were agitated. The aurors were hit with a wave of despair so potent it nearly incapacitated them. They found the remains of the sailors, what was left of them. They found the torture chambers. They fled. They went back to London, and told the ministers, "Do not go back there. Do not touch it. It is hell on earth." This discovery triggered a massive political crisis. What do you do with a place like Azkaban? The instinct of the decent majority was to destroy it, burn it to the ground, cast fiend fire, sink the island, erase the stain from existence. It seemed the only moral choice. But the experts, the Department of Mysteries, the dark lore scholars, raised a terrifying objection. They studied the Dementors and realized a hard truth. You cannot kill them. They are indestructible. You can drive them away with a Patronus, but you cannot annihilate a colony of them. And more importantly, they warned of what would happen if the fortress was destroyed. The Dementors were currently contained by the island. It was their home, their nest. If the Ministry destroyed their home, the Dementors wouldn't just vanish, they would swarm. Imagine thousands of starving Dementors leaving the North Sea and descending on the mainland. They would sweep through the villages of Scotland, the towns of England. They would feast on muggles and wizards alike. It would be a mass casualty event. It would shatter the statute of secrecy instantly. The Ministry was held hostage. They had discovered a bomb that they couldn't defuse. It was into this deadlock that a man named Damocles Rowell stepped. Rowell was elected Minister for Magic in 1718. He was a hard-liner, a man with a tough-on-justice persona. He looked at the problem of Azkaban, an indestructible fortress filled with monsters, and he looked at the problem of rising crime in the wizarding world, and he saw a solution that was as brilliant as it was evil. Rowell proposed a deal, a symbiotic relationship. The Dementors needed food. If they weren't fed, they would roam. So the Ministry would feed them, not with sailors, but with criminals. He argued that Azkaban was the perfect prison. It was inescapable. The Dementors would act as the ultimate guards. Guards you didn't have to pay. Guards that couldn't be bribed. Guards that struck terror into the hearts of the populace. Let them feed on the wicked, Rowell essentially argued. It keeps the Dementors on the island, and it keeps our society safe. There was opposition. Many wizards saw it for what it was, a crime against humanity. To sentence a wizard to Azkaban wasn't just to sentence them to confinement. It was to sentence them to psychological torture and the slow erosion of their soul. Eldritch Diggory, a later minister, visited the prison years later and was so horrified by the conditions that he resolved to close it. But he died of a mysterious illness before he could sign the order. Many believe he was assassinated by pro-Azkaban factions, or perhaps the malevolent influence of the prison itself sapped his will to live. But Rowell won the argument. He institutionalized the horror. The fortress of a mad serial killer became the cornerstone of British magical justice. Let's look at this setup through a more analytical lens. The Ministry essentially created a dark ecosystem. Azkaban isn't just a building, it's a biome. The Dementors are the apex predators. The prisoners are the livestock. The Ministry are the ranchers. This arrangement changed the nature of the Dementors. Under Ekrizdis, they were wild, starving things. Under the Ministry, they became well-fed. They multiplied. The colony grew. The atmosphere of gloom around the island deepened until it affected the weather patterns in the North Sea. Sailors knew to avoid that patch of ocean, not because of charts, but because of the sudden drop in temperature, the feeling of misery that drifted on the wind. This brings us to a fascinating comparison with the Warhammer 40k universe. In that lore, the Imperium sacrifices thousands of psychers a day to the Golden Throne to keep the Astronomicon burning. It is a monstrous attrition deemed necessary for the survival of the species. The Ministry of Magic made a similar calculation. They sacrificed the humanity of their prisoners to keep the Dementors satiated and the rest of society safe. It is a utilitarian nightmare, the suffering of the few for the safety of the many. But, as Dumbledore famously warned, they are vicious creatures. They will not remain loyal to you if Voldemort offers them more. The Ministry foolishly believed they could domesticate demons. They treated Dementors like dogs, thinking that as long as they threw them a bone, a prisoner, every now and then, they would heal. They were wrong. Even though Kingsley Shacklebolt finally removed the Dementors from Azkaban after the Second Wizarding War, the legacy of Ekrizdis remains. You cannot scrub a place like that clean. The walls of Azkaban have soaked up 500 years of screaming. In magical theory, we talk about the genius loci, the spirit of the place. Hogwarts has a benevolent spirit. It helps those who ask for it. Azkaban has a malevolent spirit. It wants to keep you. I imagine the Aurors who guard it now, even without the Dementors, feel the weight of it. They probably hear whispers in the wind, perhaps in the strange ancient language Ekrizdis spoke. They probably see shadows moving in the corner of their eyes. And the Dementors themselves? They are gone from the island, but they are not gone from the world. They are out there, drifting in the dark places of the earth. They are Ekrizdis's children, released into the wild. In our Skyrim story about the Ebony Crown, we saw how a single dark artifact could twist the mind of King Vuldar, driving him to madness and ruin. Ekrizdis is the architectural equivalent of the Ebony Crown. He created a structure that does to the soul what the crown did to the mind. He externalized his madness into stone. We also see parallels with the Falmer. The Snow Elves sought refuge underground and were betrayed, twisted into blind, aggressive creatures. The Dementors are similar, blind, aggressive, perhaps twisted forms of something that was once human. The tragedy of the Falmer is that they lost their light. The horror of the Dementor is that they consume light. There is one question that haunts me about Ekrizdis. What was his end game? We assume he was just a sadist, but wizards of that power level usually have a goal. Herpo the Foul wanted immortality. Voldemort wanted to conquer death. What if Ekrizdis wasn't just torturing sailors for fun? What if he was trying to build a battery? If Dementors consume souls, where do those souls go? They don't vanish. Energy cannot be destroyed. Is it possible that the Dementors are just collectors? That they are harvesting soul energy and depositing it somewhere? Perhaps deep beneath the foundations of Azkaban, buried under the black rock and the crushing ocean pressure, thereof our reservoir, a well of consumed souls. Was Ekrizdis trying to tap into that? Was he trying to become a god powered by the distilled essence of human suffering? It's a terrifying thought. And it suggests that the Ministry, by feeding the Dementors for 300 years, has been unwittingly filling that regards. We might not have seen the last of Ekrizdis's plan. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. A massive thank you to the community for your support. Stay safe and sweet dreams.